All right, Eric Kaufmann, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be here, Jake. Thanks for having me.
So, your book, Eric, A Third Awakening, talks about the issues with wokeness, why they're so integral in our society, and what the conflicts and problems are. How would you distinguish between people who are legitimately fighting for systemic change versus the more extreme elements, which you would call dogmatic? Like, is there a difference, and how would you distinguish?
Yeah. So I mean, and I do mention this in the book that actually, if we take left liberalism and the push for more equality and humanitarianism, we have to say that's done an enormous amount of good in the world. And not just for class, but for identity groups, that's done a huge amount of good with votes for women and for black people. So I'm saying that those are good values, but like any value, if you push it beyond a point, they can go to extremes. And it's like the metaphor of the fire. You need to have your hand close enough to get warm, but not too close or you get burned. And I think that a lot of left liberals somehow got it into their head that there's no limit to how equal we should be, how diverse we should be, how uh, humanitarian and inclusive we should be. We should just like crank those dials up to 10. And I think the problem with that is the more you move past an optimum level of diversity, equity, and inclusion towards a maximized level, the more you immiserize society. It's a bit like economic socialism. We need a welfare state. We need redistribution. Some people simply can't do it themselves. They don't have the capability. They fall through the cracks. They need health care. They need something to live on. So we have to have some redistribution. We have to have some equality. But if you push it too far, you get communism and the economy grinds to a halt or nothing gets produced. It's the same principle with culture. You need to have a certain amount of attention to representation, and you need to try and expand your recruitment pipeline if you're not getting enough women or minorities. But once you say, well, it's a hard quota, then what you do is you damage principles such as equal treatment, such as merit, such as excellence. Um, and that has enormous effects in your society. And it's similarly with inclusiveness. Yes, you want to obviously, appreciate if some people have had a harder time and maybe come from a more marginalized background. But again, if we take, that's a reasonable level of inclusion and watching what you say. Once that's taken to the point of microaggressions and you get censorship and speech codes clamping down on free speech and academic freedom, you've lost an enormous amount of freedom. You can't pursue truth properly. And again, you have a loss in
Yeah.
terms of creativity. And so what I'm saying is these principles, good principles that have been pushed too far. And the problem is because these groups have been made sacred, there's no limit. And because there's no limit, we can't reach an optimal situation where we have human flourishing. So I say there's a conflict between cultural socialism and sort of cultural richness and human flourishing. The same way there's a conflict between economic socialism and economic wealth production. There's a balance we've got to strike.
Right. And I think that nuance that you spoke to is so essential because what would be bad is if people read your work or heard you speak and thought, wow, this guy Eric Kaufmann, he doesn't care at all about marginalized people. He doesn't acknowledge the suffering we've had. He doesn't acknowledge that there's unfairness in our society. It's not that. You do acknowledge it, it sounds like, and you do think it's appropriate to take some corrective measures. But your point is that while you acknowledge that we as a society can take cultural measures to become a better society and be more just for people, the woke movement has gone too far. And the reason I think that distinction is important is because wouldn't it be a shame if people were to characterize you or others like you, like Peter Boghossian, as just being apathetic towards minority groups? Like, I think it's so essential that kind of like that balanced, nuanced message you're giving. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that is right. And people do go too far. I mean, it's tricky because, so if you take something like wanting to increase the share of an underrepresented group, um, what I would say is you should do that without violating the principle of equal treatment. So if your aim is to get more women in to engineering, and you think that the reason they're not there is because they're just never told that women can be engineers, you need to go approach high schools. You can engage in a sort of communications campaign. You can recruit at different, maybe girls' schools, whatever it is. So those are all legitimate ways of getting a more representative, quote unquote, diverse student body, while protecting the principle of equal treatment. So there's the same test scores. We're going to hold you to exactly the same standards. That way you don't violate the principle of equal treatment in classical liberalism, but you can achieve some of your goals around having better representation and more equality. That's kind of what I mean. Whereas the sort of cheap and easy way of doing that is to say we're going to throw equal treatment under the bus and we're just going to basically discriminate against whites and Asians so we get enough black people to meet a quota. And by the way, I should also say the other part of this is that some categories are not made sacred. So, for example, whether you are light-skinned or dark-skinned as a black person or a Hispanic person doesn't matter at all for any of these quota systems. And yet, I think surveys would show that is perceived as a major advantage or disadvantage within those communities. Now, you could say, and similarly if you look at the black students in the Ivy League, they're disproportionately West Indian and African origin or immigrant origin blacks rather than American origin blacks. They're disproportionately from middle and upper class rather than from working class backgrounds. Now, again, that is of no concern to people running this system because those are not sacred categories. I mean, the difference between a West Indian and an American black doesn't matter at all. And yet you obviously have a diversity problem or you have an underrepresentation problem there because American blacks are 80% of the black population and there may be only 40% of the black students. Shouldn't you also look at that? Should we also look at, class? Should we also look at a whole bunch of other things? So, disabilities of various kinds. So I'm just saying that by fixating on the sacred categories, you are also excluding a whole bunch of other categories of disadvantage that might be more important.
Yeah.
I would like to see a sort of more scientific appraisal of, what are the real sources of privilege or underprivilege? Now, it might be race. But that work, that data collecting and scientific analysis just hasn't been done to show that it's more important, that race is more important than class or more important than disability or other kinds of characteristics that don't really count as much symbolically for the left.
Do you think that there is historic discrimination against any group of people and that we should do something about that? Like without being woke, as you say, but like, is there a legitimate way to try to bridge the divide? You mentioned the example of like not enough women in a certain field. If that's the case, how do we try to reconcile that? Not for equity, but just to make sure that we can provide the same opportunity or not outcomes, but opportunity. Like, do you believe that there is a legitimate and helpful way to do that?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think, you need to look at all the procedures, practices. You should have maternity leaves. You should have flexibility of people entering and leaving and entering the workforce. You should try and for example, it may be that there are certain biases that creep in interviews. Therefore, you can perhaps, you can have application forms that don't have pictures on them or names on them or whatever. There are all kinds of these techniques that you can use to make things more kind of colorblind or sex blind or whatever if you're concerned about biases. What I would say is that all that needs to be measured and proven with significant scale studies and not just with subjective perceptions. Oh, I perceive that I was discriminated against. To me, that's some evidence, but it's relatively weak evidence because subjective perceptions are not the same thing as objective data. So that's another area in which I'm quite critical of the DEI apparatus because a lot of it is based on subjective perception reporting rather than more rigorous randomized control, experimental type techniques. And so I guess I think it's a little bit unrigorous. A lot of the sort of foundation for this philosophy. And in many cases, particularly for critical race and gender ideology, I mean, they reject the modern scientific method. They reject objective truth. I don't think you can have a conversation with anybody who rejects those things. I just think that's not a perspective worth considering. Now, what I think there's most people are reasonable, and they will accept that we need to look at data. We need to approach things scientifically. There is objective truth. And once we agree on that, we can then do the studies that can test, which methods work better, where are the outcomes. So it's all got to be outcomes driven, evidence based, and not simply sacred value based, which I think is really, really where we are in many cases with DEI. It's just, these are sacred values. We need equal outcomes, and we're going to get it no matter how. And that's it. Instead of saying, it may be, so for example, it may be that a lot of what's going on is happening between age 0 and age 18. If we take race, for example, a lot of the differences in reading comprehension and the problem happens already before age 18. So trying to sort of fix it at age 18 with a quota is, all you're doing is discriminating on the basis of race. If you really are serious about the problem, actually you have to address the actual problem, which means recognizing where along the chain the inequity is taking place. It might be at school, but in the school situation, the issue might be, well, you can't get teachers into violent schools. Maybe you need to have more discipline and more police officers to remove the small number of violent children who are actually ruining it for the others. And if you remove them, maybe you get a much better stream of talented kids from different racial backgrounds, and then you wouldn't need these artificial quotas. That's what I'm talking about, is a much more nuanced kind of evidence-led approach rather than a sort of sacred value-led approach.
And does your book and your work promote those approaches? Like, does it seek not only to dispel wokeism, but also to promote solutions like the one you just mentioned?
Yeah, so I talk about a number of things. I mean, one is that, we want to move towards a more resilient rather than a victim-based culture. And so it's not actually productive to be told, if you are from a underprivileged group, to be told that you're never going to get anywhere, the system's stacked against you, your fate lies in the hands of white people. I mean, that is a terrible message. And it's actually not true. When the critical race theorists, or when people, this approach is I think really holding back a number of different groups. So in fact, they claim to care about disadvantaged groups. I actually think, Shelby Steele in his book White Guilt argues that affirmative action is not really meant to create equality and equal outcomes. It is actually really about virtue signaling. It's a way of alleviating guilt and signifying one's moral authority, that you're one of the good whites and not one of the bad fallen whites. And I think these ancillary motives are actually what's driving a lot of this, not evidence. If it were the case that these policies really did help and were measurably helping to narrow inequality, then we could have a different conversation, and maybe I might be convinced, but the evidence is really not that.
It's so ironic that you're saying they don't genuinely care about helping people, because they probably say the same thing about you. I mean, they'd probably say, yeah, Eric Kaufmann, sure, he gives reasons of how we can bridge these gaps, of how we can create more opportunity. But come on, Eric's the guy that's shooting down all of these ideas, call them woke or not, but he's shooting down these ideas that are there to serve underprivileged people, and here he is I think for us to get along, for the woke people to get along, and for the Eric Coffins of the world to get along, I think we both have to believe the other is acting in good faith. So, are some of the woke DEI strategies probably ineffective? Definitely. Are some of them, do they go above and beyond and create more harm than good? Probably. But do I think that people who are advocating for woke policies don't actually want diversity, equity, inclusion. I mean, that's a whole that seems kind of like a sinister narrative. Like, I want to believe they're operating in good faith, don't you?
I do, but if
Why
they
can't
were,
it why can't it just be that DEI is ineffective? Why does it have to be that there's this like malicious undertone?
because if let's just say that their whole focus was on narrowing gaps, and so if your focus was really on narrowing gaps, the first thing is you would really want to be damn sure through as many rigorous studies as possible what is causing the gaps. And
I disagree. I disagree actually. Like, if you're,
okay,
I mean, maybe if you're a very rigorous data driven person, then sure. But I think most people look at reality and they say, okay, black people and women, they've got the short end of the stick the last however many years. They don't have as many opportunities, and people who maybe are not as rigorous as you are in your ability to reason logically just say, okay, let's do affirmative action, let's do a DEI program, let's bridge. Like, I don't need a more complex explanation as to why someone is doing these DEI measures when there's an apparent answer, which is like, it seems to solve an apparent problem. I mean, your point is that it doesn't do so in a, sorry, I don't want to ramble.
yeah. But you would surely want to know if it's working. You would surely want to know also, you know, you would also want to know, look, maybe there's things that I'm overlooking here, beyond just sticking a quota there. Maybe there's some things happening between age 0 and age 18 that are really, really critical here. And I might want to look at, like, what's going on in the public schools, what's going on in the family. And I don't sense that kind of genuine curiosity. I sense that there are red lines around acceptable explanations and there are unacceptable. So challenging teachers unions is not acceptable. Challenging, looking at the family and family structure is unacceptable. Looking at culture is unacceptable. So there's a whole bunch of no-go zones. There are the only places that you're allowed to go are, discrimination, insufficient money being spent, and that's it. And so I don't get the sense that they really are willing to look at the full range of explanations for the phenomenon. And if you don't know the full range of explanations, you're not going to be able to fix it properly. So John McWhorter, I mean, a number of dissident black intellectuals are saying, look, we've got to address this at an earlier stage. We have to do phonics instead of whole child learning in the public schools. We've got to do simple stuff, much more emphasis on discipline, such as in some of these inner city charter schools. And we've got to that's what we've got to do. You don't see that being advocated by anybody in this woke movement. And that's what I mean, is they're not willing to look at what has been measurably shown to work, only things that are congenial to their ideology. And that's where I'm a little bit perhaps suspicious of what are the main motives. I mean, I think that because the people that are kind of behind this are either white liberals or the more upper middle class intellectual minorities in universities. And there's an enormous attitudinal gap. I mean, a question like defund the police is a good one to tease out some of these gaps. There's an enormous gap between the actual inner city deprived poor members of these groups and the elite members of these groups and their white liberal allies. And I just think that they didn't even think, like, maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe, and the result has been thousands killed of these groups. Businesses, minority neighborhoods set back, who knows, maybe for a generation. That's what happened in the 60s. And just doesn't seem to be a willingness to sort of learn from the past and to sort of collect evidence and pursue a sort of strategy that's going to work. And I'd say the same, by the way, I'm Canadian, and I'd say the same on the Indigenous question. I think the policy is disastrous, and they're just not willing to look at the facts objectively and honestly as to what's causing, rates of alcoholism and early death and fetal alcohol syndrome and all kinds of problems on reserves. It's all the only acceptable explanation is, historic injustice, not enough money. That's it. That's all they're willing to talk about.
And for this framing of this question that we're on, who are sorry, I need like a name for when I say the people who are enforcing certain policies, who are these people? Are they like, what's the title I should give them? Are we talking about admin? Are we talking about like What's
Well,
the title?
I think, what is the title? I mean, I guess I would call them left liberals. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends. So in the survey data we have, More in Common has this term progressive activist. 8% of the US population, 13% of the UK population fit this particular category based on a whole bunch of survey questions clustering in a certain way. So we could call them progressive activists. We could call them very left-wing liberals. You know, the numbers are sort of between, I guess, 8% for progressive activists. But I would say expanding to as much as one third of the electorate on certain questions, not on all questions, but like support for defund the police, I think would be a good barometer of that group
Mhm.
at the height of defund. Yeah.
When so but in terms of the like title, like occupation of the people, like it's not you or I who has the ability to set certain policies. It would be the admin of a school or a politician, right, or a
Right.
governor. So these people, like let's call them, I'm going to use the word admin, so let's call them administrators. You're saying that they're not really sincere in what they're calling a pursuit for justice and for equality, and you're saying they're not sincere because they're overlooking such obvious solutions like helping kids when they're younger, focusing on the family, focusing on the culture. Is it possible that they're focusing on the levers that they can actually influence? For example, if we get up on a pedestal and we tell everyone, hey, you got to, follow a certain culture at home or be part of a certain culture, or hey, you should really get married and have children. Like, we can't enforce how someone lives their life in their home. What those administrators can do is create things like affirmative action and do certain policies. So why is it the case that you think they are just willingly neglecting other factors when it could also be explained that they're focusing on the variables that they can actually influence?
Because I think that it's very important, again, in the survey data, I mean, those who are on the left, who identify as on the left, derive a lot of meaning from that identity, derive more meaning from their partisanship and ideology than those on the right actually in surveys. They invest a lot of meaning in this endeavor. And to actually step out of line, to have criticized defund the police openly, I mean, now it could be that they believed, maybe somewhere they believe that this could work. I'm not going to say that's impossible, but I think there also is a strong motive that says I had better not actually say what I think on this, or I'm going to be cast out of the tribe, because that suggests that I'm not an ally, and it's in some ways seen as offensive to, perhaps a particular narrative. And so I just think there are these powerful forces of conformity. There are powerful orthodoxies that arise, and people are reluctant to challenge those orthodoxies. I mean, so for example, I mean, if they really, there are things they could do. Obviously, they could enforce discipline and exclude violent or badly behaving pupils from class, which would greatly improve the educational outcomes of minority kids. Now, they're not willing to do that because if people who are excluded are disproportionately minority, then that's seen as systemic racism. And so why is it then that they're adhering to this? I think they adhere to the belief system and they obey the dictates of that belief system, and they're not going to challenge it. And now maybe they've also convinced themselves that this is really the way to go. I mean, people do get convinced by ideologies, and maybe they think, gee, this is all part of overthrowing the white supremacist hegemony and systemic racism. Once we've overthrown that, then everything will just magically improve. So we'll just have this big cultural revolution. And when after the revolution, then all of these problems will magically sort them. So I'm not saying, that may be the way they're thinking about it, rather than saying, oh boy, if we don't actually clamp down on bad behavior, we're not going to get people getting into college. They may just, I don't know. I can't tell you which one of those thought processes is dominant.
Well, let me try to steelman the woke activist case and
Right. Yeah.
try to embody that. So I have no doubt that there are people in the woke movement who have bad intention, right? Just like in any movement. But as you're talking, like ironically, I would bet that the good faith woke people in the woke movement who are good faith probably think similarly to you in some ways. They would agree with you. So let me not say they, let me say I. So I'm gonna be now the woke activist. So
Right.
I would agree with you, Eric Kaufman, that what you care about is genuine. What do you say? You don't like the word equity or equality. What's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
right?
no, I do. I don't mind, equal.
But give me the right word. Like I know you don't like the like. What's the word that we should use for
Well, I mean,
you want you're not racist. Like you
let's
want
say
people to be treated equally. What?
let's say convergence.
Yeah, well, there's just a better word than that because that's kind of vague for me. But like what you care about, Eric, like you care about people. You
Equality, with equality is fine. I mean,
isn't equality bad? Isn't
yeah,
that one of your
inequality. Yeah, reducing inequality. How's that?
okay? So I am a woke activist, and Eric Kaufman, you and I both care deeply about reducing inequality, and we have different ways of getting there. Some of my friends in my movement take it a little too far. In some ways, they have some wild ideas that I think are ineffective. But Eric, you and I care about reducing inequality. I am not as confident as you that we should focus on culture and the home because we can't really affect those. We can't get into someone's house, and as far as focusing on outcome, maybe it's not the best way. But again, we've got to do something. We've got to do something. And this idea that that my movement is just ineffective will give us something better to do, and maybe we can work on it together. Um,
Yeah,
I,
well,
like,
I do try and mention some of this in the book. I mean, I guess the problem is sometimes the sacredness essentially surrounds certain policies with red lines,
mhm.
and it gets in the way of what I would call a rational, clear-eyed approach that would say, okay, you and I might have a difference. We should be able to sort that out with measurement, testing, falsification, the usual scientific method. Um, the reason we can't do that is because the woke side does not want to submit their claims to, in an environment of open debate and viewpoint diversity and
Well,
scientific
but
method.
here we are. I'm on the woke side. I'm here. We're debating. Here
But
we are.
you're not the typical. You're not typical. I mean,
But
most would say, I don't want to be. I'm contaminated by being on a platform with somebody who is a
some would
systemically
say that.
racist. Some would say that,
Yeah.
but I think a lot. I think the dominant attitude in the group I'm talking about, which is, let's call them the progressive activist, 8 to 13%, I think would take that more purist approach about, platforming versus, you can't be platforming such a person because they're upholding a system of structural whatever, racism, patriarchy, whatever. Um, and I think that is sort of very antithetical to the pursuit of honest truth. And so that's really sort of the
Yeah.
clash. And the way they would say, there's this argument that they would make around so-called equal speech. They'd say, well, if you allow people to speak who offend others, marginalized groups somehow, by saying things like, you know, there are good and bad things to the British Empire, or, um, you know, America might be built on stolen land, but every country is built on stolen land, so we can't actually just say that delegitimates the country. I mean, these sorts of things are then said. What they would say, that's a microaggression, and that reproduces a structure of racial inequality, a symbolic structure. Now, there's no evidence. This is not falsifiable in any scientific way. It's just asserted as a moral imperative. And that's sort of where the problem lies. They would say we can't have free speech because free speech upholds
No,
inequality.
but you're saying they can't. I guess I hear you, and I don't mean to oversimplify it. Like it's
Hmm.
not fair for me to say, hey, everything you're saying is wrong, and I am a real representation of woke
Right.
activists because I'm not.
Right.
But that being said, just humor me. And you're describing what's out there and why they're so problematic. But I'm saying I'm a woke. Let's say I'm a woke activist. I'm sitting here and I'm telling you, Eric Kaufman, I care about reducing inequality. I want to focus on the levers that we can actually pull to reduce inequality. It's a really hard problem because we can't tell someone what culture to have. We can't affect someone's life at home. We sometimes, unfortunately, have to focus on outcome when there's no other option. And I know you care about that, and I care about that. And I'm saying to you that although I don't have all the data in the world, what I care about is affecting the levers that I'm able to, which are not to influence someone's culture or family life, but rather in the school, in the workforce, and sometimes, unfortunately, focusing too much on outcome, but again, really just relying on whatever we can do to bridge the gap. And as you said, get to convergence. So what do you think about that? What do you like? What do you think about my idea that I just said, that like as someone that's I can identify as woke activist with woke ideas, but I care about the same thing that you do, which is convergence to reduce racial disparity. Why don't you see my efforts as legitimate, given everything I just said?
Well, I see your goal as legitimate. Um, and I mean, you're, what I would say is a woke person probably wouldn't, I
You're
don't think
saying
they,
wouldn't. I'm saying, so if you don't
okay.
want to
So
be
okay,
called
let me
woke,
just say that, all right, I guess I wouldn't call you woke if you're
okay,
willing to actually look at all methods, even
okay,
if they result in, for example, higher incarceration and exclusion rates for members of certain groups than for members of other groups. So if that disparity, if you're okay with that disparity as a way of, so increasing disparity in terms of punishment at school, in terms of criminal sentencing, will get us towards a narrower disparity in terms of education and economic outcomes. If you're in agreement with that, then I think we have a big
okay.
area that we can agree on. I mean, the other thing I would say is on the family stuff. I do think that if the mainstream says, if the mainstream is to say, well, look, and studies have found, family structure accounts for like a third, I think, of the race gap, at least, that, surely this is something that we need to have a conversation about. And a lot of Black intellectuals do think that's an issue, do think that some of these culture factors are an issue, and we can actually support them in their efforts to have some sort of cultural reform or revival movements that would try and return the Black family to the way it was in the 1950s and 60s, when it was basically intact, and to return the incarceration levels to the levels of the early 20th century, which were actually not that different from the white levels. Then, I think that is a productive way to go as well. I mean, it's not the whole picture, but we have to be looking at every possible lever and not saying, well, no, those are out of bounds because that is a violation of the sacred. And that's why I would say that a truly woke person would not even,
Mm.
they would just shrink away from anything that would,
So
yeah,
that's interesting. So my exercise that I'm trying to do, like
yeah,
to have myself steal a man and represent what I think could be a
mm,
good faith woke argument. You're saying on face value, once I finish speaking, you're saying, Jake, like I can respond to that, but I'm not responding to a woke activist because inherent, in your view, inherent to wokeology is the refusal to acknowledge some of the things I acknowledged. And therefore, what I just told you, attempting to be, a woke activist, you're saying contradicts myself, like contradicts the title that I'm trying to attribute to myself in your view,
yeah, yeah.
right?
Exactly. I mean, you sort of sound like a sensible center leftist. Not, I
Ah,
mean, because I would say that a woke person would just, as a sacred value, would just not even be willing to entertain any policy that has a disparate impact, as they would define it, or any sort
yeah.
of an unequal disparity. So disparity in criminal sentencing or exclusion from school. So I just don't think you wouldn't even get off the starting block, I would say, because of the sacred
Got it.
value. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll move on from this exercise because maybe it's not a very fruitful one, but I just think there's something important here, which is that the underlying mission and motive seems to be aligned between you and, dare I say it, a woke activist, which is that you both, if you take each other to be good faith, which they probably don't think you're good faith and you don't think they are, but I think you probably both are and have different ways of approaching it. And one of, maybe they're not as data driven. But if I guess it would be important, like you're saying, for a woke activist to acknowledge what I said about the different potential levers and the ones you can and can't push. So in that case, if it's not fair for me to say that that argument's a woke argument, you say it's more centrist or central left. So in that case, if I am a center left person and I say to you those things I said, which is that Eric, I may call me whatever you want to call me, center left. Um, I care about reducing. Uh, I care about increasing convergence and reducing racial inequality, and I want to focus on the levers that I have access to. without being redundant, but like I said before, I can't really influence family and culture. I can influence the workplace and the schoolroom. Why can't I, in good faith, focus on those? Focus on something. We got to do something, right? I want to do. I don't want to do nothing. So
Yeah. Well, I'd say do what the evidence shows works and test
yeah,
theories. I mean, what I would also say, however, is, you could say, there is a way to get convergence, which is through quotas in absolutely every aspect of life. So we're going to have a fixed quota for CEOs, for boardrooms, for companies, for everything, pilots, you name it. We're going to have race and sex quotas, and it's going to be 50-50 men and women. It's going to be 13% black and is it 19% Hispanic, whatever it is. And that will be the way we get perfect equality, right? So what would be the problem with that? And I think a lot of woke people would say, great, we got equality by essentially leveling down. We're going to level others down through discrimination, and we're going to sacrifice, equal treatment, freedom, merit, all of these things to get equality. So there is also another problem, which is, if you're assuming that somebody wants to actually fix whatever it is that's causing the inequality instead of just
I,
declaring it and enforcing it. And I'm not
yeah.
so sure that a woke person would take that view. I think they would actually think, well, it'd be nice if we fixed it, but we just want it now, and we'll get it however we can get it.
I know, but respond to what I'm saying though.
Okay.
Because you're saying a person wouldn't say this. They wouldn't say this. I'm saying this. I'm saying let's focus on the levers that we can control. We can't control culture. We can't control what someone's home life is like. We can control something like what happens in the schoolroom or in the workforce. So therefore, me, Jake Newfield, I want to, let me be less hypothetical so that it's easier to kind of respond to. So how do I truly, genuinely feel is probably, is that I like you, I think we should, as you said, get to convergence or get to equality, and that I do genuinely feel like we have limited levers to pull. And I think it would be a shame to look at pulling maybe the less effective levers as some kind of malicious attempt to undercut true justice. And I sincerely think that I don't know, we should do something, right? We got to do
Yeah, I mean,
something,
look,
and we're
well,
limited.
I mean, I think what perfectly illustrates it, if you take the American case, it would seem to me an obvious thing, if you cared about women having higher representation in the workforce, might be to do something about the length of maternity leave, make it more European. To me,
Yeah,
the activism from the feminists should be all on that, and forget all
yeah,
about all of this other stuff around the boardrooms and that stuff, which is really where a lot of the action is in terms of what people, or the cultural stuff, or the language that people use. All of these sorts of things are simply nowhere near as important as something as basic as, okay, let's improve maternity leave, let's make it more European. I mean, that
I
would
see.
really have a much bigger concrete effect than all the DEI stuff. And yet, that they don't care about that. Now that to me is an example of where it's not really results driven. It is symbolic, in much more of making a symbolic statement. Now, maybe in their heart of hearts, they believe that if you have a cultural revolution, the economics will just follow naturally from that, and you'll automatically get some magical, all the disparities will just disappear. I maybe that's what they've convinced themselves of, but just in terms of measurement and data, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a very practical approach. So
Hmm.
yeah, but I think I would agree with the goal. And if your aim is to identify the actual levers, now we may disagree. I think the cultural ones can actually be influenced. The other thing I think is creating a mindset that is victim based rather than resilient is also not a good idea. So in reinforcing people's perceptions that things are stacked against them, the society is racist or sexist or whatever, I think is actually to hold people back. And again, happy to have that tested out. I've done some research on that showing that, and also the other research you see is that a lot of African Americans actually, they would almost prefer a future where they have become more confident, and therefore, even if they do encounter something racist, it just rolls off them and they just say whatever. I mean, they would prefer that kind of a future where they're just so confident that, bits of, microaggression or whatever just doesn't affect them, as opposed to left liberals who are much more desirous of having this zero tolerance. You'll never have any racist epithet, no microaggressions, no nothing, because we policed it all to zero. I mean, that's the kind of society that the white left liberals in the surveys seem to prefer, rather than the much more resilient African American outcome. So what I'm saying in a way is, I think that minorities would rather stand on their own feet and be stronger and be more resilient, rather than be kind of these victims that everyone's feeling sorry for and tiptoeing around and therefore not offended. I mean, so I think there's a different view of, do you want a fragile, more victim-based culture, society, or a more resilient one where, yeah, there's going to be some racism, there's going to be, but that's just not the end of the world. And so I guess partly these are clashing visions of where we need to go. And I think a lot of the snowflake fragility and all of this stuff comes out of that emphasis on subjective victimhood. And of course, the subjective victimhood is then what clashes with freedom of speech. And so we also haven't talked about competing values, right? Merit, beauty, excellent, but also freedom of speech. Freedom of speech and your sense of freedom is also imperiled when claims around victimhood and inclusion trump rights to speech. And we see that a lot in organizations with cancel culture, for example.
What should we do to improve equality? You mentioned earlier when I asked, like, what is the word or what is the thing that we're ultimately striving for justice? Like, not just what's wrong with wokeism, but what should replace it? Like, how do we get to equality? What are your ideas for how we improve equality?
Well, if it's racial equality, let's say, I mean, I would say it's down to, age 0 to 18, and it's down to kind of, that's where, if you're going to put money in, maybe even 0 to 5, but first of all, removing the violent offenders, the small number of people who cause most of the mayhem, should be in jail. And they should be in jail. They're repeat offenders. Those people need to be in jail. I would say, exclusion of, again, the small number of pupils who ruin the learning experience for everyone else in these poor areas. Not in the rich areas is not a problem, but in the poor areas. So I think that too would be a solution, a simpler approach to learning. John McWhorter talks about phonics-based rather than these fashionable whole child-based learnings. I think getting rid of critical race and gender ideology that tends to inculcate a sort of passivity and sense of victimhood and loss of agency in kids. I think that would be something else I would do. And I also think, you need to pay attention to, now, if we're talking about the indigenous issue, I would say
that would improve. How would putting people in prison improve equality?
Because you make everybody else more secure, and therefore they can start businesses, they have more freedom, they can be more creative. The security means that kids can focus on learning, they can focus on being normal kids and playing outside and building social capital and all these things that are just impossible when you've got gunshots and you've got knives. So that, I think, is critical. You need policing and you need security in these very deprived areas where things are chaotic, too chaotic to set up businesses, to invest, to take care of property, all of these things. And similarly with learning, again, if you take away if you're always focusing on unruly, disruptive kids, then you can't pay attention to the kids who have potential. Again, and it's the same dynamic where, yes, you're going to have a higher exclusion rate by race in jails, in schools, but on the other hand, you're going to have more people making it into college and making more money and narrowing the wealth gap. So, one type of exclusion is necessary in order to narrow the more important types of exclusion. And so that's one thing. The other thing I'd say is, I do think that the cultural thing needs to be addressed and can be addressed if we support the voices that are calling for intact families, for example, as being a key to economic success and many other kinds of success. It just is, and the data is extremely strong, and so there's no point. Now, of course, these problems are now in the white working class as well, so it's not a race issue necessarily, but it will probably help Black people more than white people because there's a higher poverty rate. So those are just some things that, I mean, if we move towards this more kind of resilient based, and I think the other part of this is, if you have a narrative that says, I don't have control over my own life, what's called self-efficacy or locus of control. And that's very important to people's mental health and to their economic success. And if you have an attitude that says, it's all somebody else's fault and I'm not going to get ahead, everything's stacked against me, I just think that's a terrible message.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think although those are my ideas, I think also on the indigenous, I mean, there's specific things like on indigenous reserves, for example. It's communal land ownership, so there's no incentive to take care of your property, to build a business. There are so many disincentives. There's no focus on how do we control the alcoholism that is just killing these communities, and that goes unacknowledged. And the more you emphasize that whatever's happened in the past, traumas, that's really the cause of your problems, induces a passivity rather than a sort of an active engagement in a sense of self-efficacy. You're in control of your life. You have agency. You have responsibility for yourself and your community. Take that response. I just think that would be a revolution, and there have been times in the past where that's occurred actually. And so I just think that would be a different story, but it means telling a different history. It's not a victim-based history, emphasizing where the community was resourceful and strong and successful. It's a more positive outlook and not so much a victim-based outlook.
And earlier, like I think you acknowledged there is inequality today. Is that fair? Like,
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment? Okay. So there is inequality today. I'm asking, how do we fix it? Is one of the solutions to fix inequality for people to just not have a victimhood mindset?
Yeah, I think. I mean, because look,
so it's not equal because they're such victims. I mean,
well, look, there's a certain degree to which they are victims, and a certain degree to which they're not victims. You would ideally want them to be making an error in thinking they are not victims when they are. I think that would be more productive in terms of them succeeding, rather than the reverse, which I think is where our culture emphasizes.
But we can't believe that the reason why certain people have inequality is because they have a loser mindset. Like, that can't be the root of the problem, right?
Well,
there's no way.
It can be part of the problem if we know, for example, in psychology, we know that this concept of locus of control, being in control, and that's a scale psychologists use, a 20-question scale, that is heavily correlated with personal success and outcomes. And
sure.
And in fact, so if you have reduced locus of control as a result of a victim narrative, that you are essentially told you can't get ahead because of all these roadblocks, then you're actually going to have less success in your life. So I think these are all things that I think are worth trying and make sense.
It matters for sure. It matters. But I'm saying, like, if we have, there's 350 million people in this country, if we're saying that like millions of people, don't have the right equality, some of them, they have this terrible, shitty mindset where they think they're a failure. They're never going to try harder. They're depressed, whatever. But to say, okay, the 20 million people in this country who don't have the equality they deserve, they're all just a bunch of, they just think of themselves as victims. And if only they would not think of themselves as victims, then all of a sudden those 20 million people would rise up and gain that equality. I mean, I'm just saying, like, is it really just that? Is it that simple?
No, it's not.
Could it be that there's something in our society? Could it be that there's other systems in place? Like, I don't know. Like you said, cultural in the house. I mean,
I think that, I mean, and I think if there is discrimination, we need to be able to measure it. And we need people to say, no, it's not discrimination, and others to say, yes, it is, to have a debate so that the science can proceed. Right now, in academia, to argue against somebody who says it's discrimination is almost impossible. you are so disincentivized from doing that. So we don't actually know, because there's obviously going to be a natural rate of inequality. When I say that, I mean, for example, there are reasons why you're going to have more women in veterinary science than in
Yeah.
IT and computing and engineering. And there is a degree to which that is natural as a result of evolutionary psychology, as a result of just what people choose to do. And the more equal, by the way, the more equal societies tend to have more of a spread by sex. So women are more likely to
Yeah.
be in psychology and veterinary science in a wealthy egalitarian society than in Iran. So part of this is choice. And so we have to be willing to accept a certain degree of non-representation in computing, computer programming, and in IT, whatever. They're also, because part of the other part of this is, it's not just marginalized groups who have rights. It's also groups that are historically been dominant that have rights. So men do have, I think a message that is constantly saying there's sexism in computing and engineering when there isn't. I mean, you have to prove these things. I just think that is also creating resentment and is creating problems and divisions which feed into polarization. So that's the other part. It's not just about minorities, but I think what we're actually getting is the worst of both worlds. We're getting suboptimality for minorities, and we're getting suboptimality for dominant groups as well. And I just think it would be worth trying a different approach. Let's see how the different approach works. We've been trying this approach basically for, I would argue, since the 1960s. I don't think it's worked. Now but again, there is some truth to it. So we have, clearly there was worse discrimination and racism and sexism. I think now, but the thing is, we don't know where we are on that curve. How, to actually get that extra increment of non-discrimination, we may have to violate freedom and objective truth and social cohesion so egregiously. It's just not worth it in terms of human flourishing. I mean, that we'd be better off just trying to inculcate more resilience so that whatever the remaining bits of this stuff are that exist, that's maybe a more effective way to deal with it. But of course, if there are certain rules, like, so for example, it may be that we have to look at, in academia, how promotion happens. It tends to happen at the same time people have children. Can we look at that in a way? Can we make allowances for people so they don't have a tenure clock that's 7 years? Maybe we can allow for someone has a child or whatever. I think there are all kinds of ways we can deal with that, and still have a level playing field.
What are the causes of inequality? You mentioned that you're saying one of them is mindset. Let's say I agree. What are the other causes of inequality in this country?
Boy, well, I mean, there are things that are quite banal. I think if you live in a very remote part of the country, you're going to have poorer outcomes, regardless of your race, sex, whatever. Clearly, genetically, some people, have higher IQ than others. And this is not about race or sex or anything. It's just, there's a random draw. We know this. And so you're going to be lucky. So we never talk about IQ privilege, but it's an enormous privilege. Some people are just smarter than others. That's a huge privilege. Some are better looking. Some are taller. The average CEO is 6'2". These are privileges. They all drive, they're all connected to certain kinds of decisions. Maybe we should be looking at those as well. So these are all sources of inequality. And now, I mean, I'm certainly open to the idea that, maybe people have networks, perhaps they've got social networks that get each other jobs, and we've got to look at, and that's why, you have to get meritocratic procedures that are cutting out nepotism and legacies and the impact of contacts. And yeah, I think that I would get behind. If you're trying to get rid of nepotism or network effects that benefit certain groups, absolutely do that through a process that says that, everyone has to apply centrally, or no names on CVs, or whatever it is. So there are different ways of, I think, making it fairer. without going the
Why
route of
why
quotas.
why would it benefit someone to not use a name on a CV? Like what's the type of name that you think make it harder for someone to get a job?
Well, just if we were worried about foreign sounding name, there have been these CV
Mhm,
studies, which are some of the more rigorous
mhm,
approaches to looking at discrimination in housing and in jobs. Although I think there are problems with the way some of these studies have been done, but particularly like a Muslim name, that kind of
yeah,
thing, does tend to get fewer callbacks, so there is, and that's now, of course, fewer callbacks, not just from white people. So it's not just from white people, but from people of
mhm.
all racial backgrounds. And so,
Can I
yeah,
ask, I have a burning question I need to
yeah,
ask. Sorry for cutting in. So moments ago, I asked you, what are the potential causes of inequality in this country? And you mentioned where we live could be one, like if you're in a poor area. You mentioned IQ. You've also spoken about mindset, like if you have a
mm,
victim mindset, that's not going to work out for you.
right,
But with the CV example, it sounds like if someone, let's say, let's say if someone's Muslim or has a Muslim or Arab sounding name, and they have that on the CV, then it might be harder for them to get the job. So, to your list of things that maybe in this country perpetuate inequality, is it fair for me to say that Muslims or Arabs or whatever people with Muslim sounding names are discriminated against because of their name, because of the example you just gave? Is that a
yeah,
fair
I think
statement?
that is fair. Yeah. Now the
Okay.
question is,
So so
yeah,
so what do we do about that? So it's not just where you live, it's not just how smart you are, it's also something like race maybe, right? If your
well,
religion,
it
right?
could
Like if
be. I
you're
mean,
Muslim.
yeah, I think that it's
Yeah.
very hard to test. It's tricky to test on race with, say, American Black, because the surnames are not distinctive enough. The first names might be, but then the first names also carry class connotations, and that's been one of the criticism. But certainly with the Muslim name, like in Germany, these studies where you have a Muslim name, yes, they get far fewer callbacks. So there's no question discrimination is part of
Okay.
it, absolutely. Now the question is how big a part of it, right? Because the groups that actually get discriminated against in the CV studies actually aren't the ones that have the largest inequality in terms of earning potential, let's say. In the US, for example, Arab Muslims are not doing badly. Now, the question might be, okay, well, maybe they would be doing even better. They would have an even higher income premium without the discrimination. And I think that might be true, right? So they may be even more successful. So we need to know that. But what I would say the solution there is to um, that's individual. First of all, I would say that's individual level discrimination, not structural. Structural discrimination is this idea of racism without racists. That CV study is really about individual level discrimination, and so I think there are
But if
ways.
every
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. Please don't let me.
Mm.
Sorry. I'm looking at the clock. I'm getting
Yeah, yeah,
anxious that we're
yeah.
running out of
Please
time. So
do. Please do.
what do you have a hard stop at?
Yeah, you just we'll go till, yeah, we can drift a little
Okay,
past it. Yeah.
I'm
It's good. It's good
I'm,
conversation.
my question about is it individual versus systemic racism? I'm not, by the way, I am not the expert here. I'm just trying to
Yeah, yeah,
push and
yeah.
prod you. But if we find that like across the country, people with Muslim names have a harder time getting jobs, I don't know if you call that individual. I have no idea if you call it systemic. I don't know. But what I do know is that that's pretty widespread, right?
Mm.
That is a pretty global, like widespread phenomenon. If Muslim sounding names, people who are Muslim with Muslim sounding names have a harder time getting the callback, that is some type of problem. Call it whatever you want, but it's
Mm.
something that we should address, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And
Um,
how do we address it? How do we address
so
that?
one of the
Is
ways
that
is just not having those names on the CVs.
yeah,
Like, let's just take simple things, right? Is just make those things as neutral as you can make them. I would say is an obvious thing. There are all kinds of techniques like these with orchestras. One of the things they did initially was to go behind a screen, and so you couldn't see the sex of the person playing the violin or whatever. And now, actually, that's led to apparently it's not produced the results desired. So they've gone back to, making it visible, which I think does tell against the DEI approach. But yeah, I think anywhere where you can kind of can you get rid of interviews? I would even be maybe that's a bridge too far, but I think why not? I mean, can we not design a good enough questionnaire? Can we not? I don't know, maybe it's unrealistic and maybe people aren't going to want that. But I'm just saying there are probably ways that we could make it more neutral. The other thing I would say is that we don't yet know exactly how big a penalty something like a name exerts, because as I said, the groups that are seeming to experience the biggest penalties on the CV field studies are not the groups that have the biggest wealth gap or income gap. In fact, some of those groups are doing pretty well. So it's not settled science. The other thing I think is that we don't know whether in large, prestigious corporations and organizations, because I think a lot of these studies tend to focus on small businesses, garages or people wanting to rent, So I think so there is discrimination there clearly, but I just don't know whether it's, this is, first of all, I think there's a distinction between this individual level and the systemic, because that is very much a claim that is made by a lot of the people on the cultural left, is that there's something systemic. It's not the bad apples. It's not the individual racism. It's something in the system. That is not, it's not measurable, testable. I mean, I would want to know, how do I measure a system or something systemic that is not individual? I think that's a crucial question for anyone trying to defend the systemic racism argument. I would need to know how to measure that and how to
Could it be that we're having a semantic disagreement about it? Because if 80%, if 8 million resume readers, if all the universities or companies or whatever in the US, if everyone who is getting that resume and reading it, if half of those people are racist, I don't know that it matters whether we call it systemic or individual, because at the end of the day, you've got half the country that's discriminating against Muslim sounding names. So call it whatever we want. And I don't know the definition, by the way. I don't know the proper definition for systemic or not, but wouldn't you agree that we're kind of talking about the same thing, right? Like, whether you want to say individual or systemic, it is a universal racism in the country. If widespread, if we find that largely people with Muslim sounding names don't get callbacks for jobs.
Well, yeah,
right?
I would absolutely agree with you, but I also think it's very important, when all the evidence we have is that whites are not more likely to be discriminating than other groups in these studies. And similarly, studies of, for example, race hate, violent incidents, again, show whites to be underrepresented in these. I mean, that is not coming out in the DEI. The DEI is very much setting up this majority-minority, white male versus the other paradigm and demonizing certain groups and essentially saying other groups are victim. In fact, it's all groups doing it to all groups. And that's important, because, again, we have to get back to the point I made earlier, is that all groups have rights. And if you're traducing just one group and you don't have the evidence behind it, I actually think that's causing polarization and division in the country. We have to render an accurate verdict of who is discriminating against who, and it's an all against all thing. And we also have to get a sense of how significant this is. So a callback study doesn't necessarily, that will give you a sense, but it is not exactly, it's what you're not sure about is, if there's a discrepancy, the question is, what is the scale of this thing? I mean, that's what's difficult to know.
Do you think that Muslims in this country are discriminated against? Like, is the resume example, is that telling of a broader?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, I guess certainly at that stage, the evidence, in my view, is there for discrimination. And now, there are people who say that once people sit down at an interview stage, then those prejudices fall away. You treat the person more as an individual. I think it probably depends what kind of Muslim. I mean, if they have a headscarf on, then probably there will be a prejudice there. And there have been studies in Germany that even if you keep the name as a Turkish name, if you put a headscarf on or remove a headscarf, that has a big impact on callbacks. So yeah, is there discrimination there? I think undoubtedly there's a certain level of discrimination. Yes.
I don't know the difference, candidly, between like what is considered systemic versus individual, but and I don't know the term to me. I don't know if it matters. Like where I think what matters more is like, is it a problem? What's the implication? How do we, what do we do about it? So we don't have to use the word systemic, but if you're in agreement that there's a kind of large scale discrimination against Muslims in this country,
Well, I wouldn't say
should
large.
we?
I don't know if it's large scale. I think there is,
Yeah,
but how much it would impact on a job search for a Muslim individual and they're rising through organizations, and I think that's yet to be quantified.
okay.
So I don't know how big it is. I think it's not zero. I
And what?
certainly think it's not zero.
Yeah. And final question on this: what do we do about it, other than the resume thing? Like, if we do, like, is there other things we should do about it, or I guess like what levers do you focus on in that case?
Well, I think we should be measuring. I do think we should be measuring outcomes. How many people applied, what's their religion, what's their ethnicity, whatever, what's their sex, how many proceeded to the next stage, I think we should definitely be monitoring. And if there is a disproportionate impact, we should, and it can't be explained by performance measures, then yeah, that is grounds for taking some kind of action. What is it? What is the reason? I think then you would probably have to try and figure out what the reason is qualitatively, then develop some questions that can be used on a larger scale quantitative survey,
Yeah.
and then design your policies using randomized controlled trials. What actually works? So I would,
Yeah. What would a policy look like? Like, you don't want to focus on outcome, right?
Well,
So what do we do?
Well, no, you do focus on outcomes, but you're also controlling for confounding factors. So if, just to take a crude example, if every Muslim applicant didn't have a degree or didn't make their sales target, then clearly those, you have to control for these other confounding factors. And if you still have an unexplained difference by religion, then you've got discrimination there. I think that's legitimate. So I don't think people on my side of the ledger would dispute that that's legitimate, and therefore you need.
And then what do you do? What do you do if there is legitimate racial discrimination that can't be explained by other confounding factors?
Well, I think I think it's fine to have, if you want to talk about diversity training, it's fine to talk about the results of these studies and to show, actually, look here, we've identified, we've controlled for all these other factors. There's a whole literature that's done all these studies that's attempted to refute these results, and look, they've all finding the same thing. This is the size of the effect, and this is what we're going to do. So I would say, well, let's test out a few things. I mentioned, blind CVs. I mentioned, maybe doing interviews with people who are hiring and people who are not hiring to find out why the person wasn't hired, and then trying to address why that is the case. Did it happen because of a performance at an interview stage? What element of performance? What kind of coaching? Certainly you can coach groups that don't do well, and just, but the main thing I'd say, if you're going to do the diversity training, is not to make it.
I'm not saying I didn't say diversity training. I didn't say we should do that. It's a genuine. There's no. I don't have really a hidden agenda. It's a genuine question. Like, if there is racism, I don't know much about diversity training. Frankly, I've heard.
But I'd also say, by the way,
well, my question is like genuine question. Like, what do we do? Like, if there's racism, and it's not because
Yeah, I think monitoring, training, procedures like getting rid of interviews and blinding surveys, or the resumes, taking the names off the resumes, the pictures off the resumes, which I think they do already to some degree. The only thing I'd say is that we also have to focus on, like, if someone's in a wheelchair, if somebody is short or very tall or not, very fat. There are a whole bunch of other things, has a stutter. There may be a whole bunch of other things that are also other things that would make you less successful. So there's other kinds of discrimination other than race, gender, sexuality, which don't get much attention because they're not politically important and meaningful in this ideology. And so I would like to see a much more rounded set of characteristics, so that when you do your diversity training, you're talking about everybody doing it to everybody, not just whites doing it to non-white. It's actually everyone on everyone. We're talking about many more types of categories that are important for discrimination, for privilege, than just the Holy Trinity. So that's all I'm saying, is that we need to, so I would accept that if that was what DEI was, and we were talking about even, even people with tattoos. I don't have a tattoo, but there's a whole set of different way of doing this that is much less the narrative and the binary just feeding into the same woke trinity. And that's kind of where I think that should go.
Got it. Got it. On so just doing a quick check in here. I really appreciate this, man. This is really fascinating, and I think these are important topics. And I've been kind of debating you so much that I haven't really been able to dig into some of these other things.
It's fine. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the chat. The pushback is good, and
because not everyone pushes back. It's like Constantine and Jordan Peterson. Like they are drinking your Kool-Aid. And,
yeah.
And
no, exactly. And it's fun to have in some ways it's more fun to have the pushback because you get to kind of say, okay, where are the differences here? And also maybe gets to some kind of an accommodation or at least we can see, okay, maybe you value equality more. I value, freedom and merit or whatever, or maybe not, but at least you kind of get to see where the differences are.
Yeah. Everything is so polarized, and like the irony to me, like maybe I'm being very naive by saying like, oh, well, we all want the same thing. Like, yeah, Hitler, every evil person out there has what they would consider good intentions. Like everyone cares about safety, security, health, and happiness. And so it's naive for me to say, oh, well, you have the same, goals as a woke activist. But I mean, beyond my naivete, like I think there's a deeper truth there, which is the irony here is like you're expending a lot of resources and energy to find cultural solutions, and so are the woke activists, and they're doing it so in very different ways. And I think your point is that they're doing so in a very dogmatic way. I think that most of the country, I would hope, is somewhere in the middle where they want to see change. They hopefully have some ability to suss through data. But I don't. It would be unfortunate. I'll say this: it would be unfortunate if people, like whether they're on the left or in the middle, were to view anti-woke policies as necessarily racist policies or as people that don't care about the issues. When in fact, I think it's the opposite, right? I think that it's because you care about equality, it's because you care about justice, that you think wokeness is infringing on it.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's part of the reason, right? So I care. I mean, assuming that the woke people do want convergence of narrowing of inequality, then yes, that's a shared value. But I also think they probably don't value some of the things that I would value, so they probably wouldn't value as highly. Freedom of expression, equal treatment, objective truth, these sorts of things, or indeed probably social cohesion and certainly the attachments of majority groups, ethnic majorities to the nation, to their, these are all things, or males. So I think those sorts of things would come quite low. You see that in the survey data where, so white liberals tend to be cooler towards white people, tend to not be attached to being white, let's just say, whereas members of minority groups, regardless of their politics, tend to be more attached to their group than to other groups. So to some extent, white liberals really are an exception on this. So they don't have a real group identity, and they tend to have weaker identification to the nation, let's just say. So, and that's fine. I mean, not everybody, it's like, do you really like, are you super attached to your extended family? Some are, some aren't. I mean, it's fine. It's a choice. But I just think there are also differences of value as well as shared values, but different approaches, which is what we're talking about with equality. I think there's a shared value that a lot of people have, but a different view as to what's going to get us there. But in other cases, there are wholly different values. So I don't think a lot of people on the progressive cultural left care that much about their white identity, and they don't care that much. They care less about national traditions, for example, speech traditions, classical literature, and so on.
Got it. There was a difference there.
Yeah.
Let me unfortunately end the recording, and then maybe we can wrap up for a couple minutes. I have to